the spring of 1885, the Wyoming Territory was cattle country, where vast herds moved across endless grasslands under skies so wide they seemed to swallow a man whole. Here, a man's worth was measured by the size of his spread, the loyalty of his crew, and his ability to withstand the brutal elements that could turn from gentle to murderous in the span of a single afternoon. It was in this unforgiving landscape, in the shadow of the Wind River Mountains, that ranch foreman Daniel "Bull" McKenna learned that 40 years of honest work and unwavering loyalty meant nothing when faced with the ambitions of Eastern investors and their hired killers. McKenna had earned his nickname not from his size, though at 6'4" with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, he was an imposing figure, but from his legendary ability to handle the most dangerous longhorn bulls with nothing but rope and raw courage. Men still talked about the time he'd walked straight into a pen with a rampaging Hereford bull that had gored 2 cowboys, speaking to the beast in low tones until the animal calmed enough for McKenna to lead it away like a pet dog. At 53, his face was weathered as old saddle leather, creased with lines that mapped decades of squinting into prairie sun and winter blizzards. His hands were gnarled instruments, calloused from rope burns and rains, but they could still gentle a spooked horse or splint a broken leg with surprising delicacy. He was the best cattleman in 3 territories, a man who could read weather patterns like scripture, predicting storms days before they appeared on the horizon. He knew every waterhole and grazing ground from the Platte River to the Yellowstone, could tell by the taste of grass whether it would fatten cattle or leave them hungry, and had an almost supernatural ability to find strays in country where other men got lost and died. For 15 years, he'd managed the Circle M Ranch for old Marcus Caldwell, building it from a modest homestead into one of the largest cattle operations in Wyoming. Under McKenna's guidance, the ranch had weathered the blizzard of '78 that wiped out half the herds in the territory, survived the drought of '81 when creeks dried to dust, and prospered while neighboring spreads failed or sold out to Eastern syndicates. The ranch hands respected him not just for his skill, but for his fairness. McKenna never asked a man to do something he wouldn't do himself, and he paid good wages on time, even when money was tight. Old Caldwell had recognized McKenna's value, treating him more as a partner than an employee. "This land needs men like you, Bull," Caldwell had told him during their last conversation, as the old rancher's consumption worsened. "Men who see it as something more than dollars and cents. When I'm gone, I want you to have a real stake in what you've helped build." The promise of partnership had kept McKenna going through long winters and difficult drives. The knowledge that someday part of the Circle M would be his, a legacy he could pass on to the children he'd never had time to father. That promise died with Caldwell, buried in the small cemetery on the ranch alongside the old man's wife and infant son. McKenna's troubles began when the ranch was inherited by Caldwell's nephew, a Boston banker named Reginald Ashworth, who had never set foot west of the Mississippi, and who saw the Wyoming spread as nothing more than numbers on a ledger. Ashworth arrived in a private rail car, dressed in an Eastern suit that cost more than a cowhand's yearly wage, accompanied by accountants and efficiency experts, who looked at the vast operation with calculating eyes that missed the beauty of the land but caught every opportunity for profit. "The cattle business is changing, McKenna," Ashworth had explained during his first visit to the ranch, sipping brandy in what had been Caldwell's simple office, now cluttered with maps and financial reports. "We need to modernize, bring in efficiency experts, maximize profits per acre. The old ways, your ways, are becoming obsolete." McKenna had listened silently, his weathered face betraying nothing of the unease growing in his gut. He'd seen this pattern before on other ranches. Eastern money moving in, old hands pushed out, land carved up for speculation rather than sustainable ranching. What Ashworth really meant, as McKenna would soon discover, was that he'd already sold the ranch to a railroad syndicate that wanted the land for a new rail line connecting Denver to the Northern Territories. The cattle, the buildings, and the men who'd spent their lives building the operation were all obstacles to be removed as cheaply as possible. The betrayal came from McKenna's own segundo, an ambitious young cowboy named Jack Hartwell. At 32, Hartwell was everything McKenna had once been. Strong, skilled, and hungry for success, but without the older man's sense of honor or connection to the land. Where McKenna saw stewardship, Hartwell saw opportunity. Where the older man valued loyalty, the younger prized advancement. Hartwell had been secretly working for Ashworth's Eastern associates for months, feeding them information about the ranch's operations and weaknesses. His boyish face, always quick with a smile or a joke, had hidden a calculating mind that saw McKenna as a relic of a dying era. "Bull, we've got reports of rustlers working the north pasture," Hartwell had said one morning, his concern seemingly genuine. "Simmons thinks he saw campfire smoke up by Cottonwood Creek last night." McKenna had nodded, trusting as always in his segundo's information. "I'll ride up and take a look. You keep the men working on that broken fence line in the south section." It was a decision that nearly cost him his life. The reports were nothing more than bait for a trap, carefully laid by Hartwell to get McKenna alone and vulnerable. The north pasture was a remote section of the ranch, a series of rolling hills and hidden draws where the best summer grazing could be found. McKenna rode out at dawn, his trusted buckskin gelding picking its way through the sagebrush as the sun climbed higher. By midday, he'd reached Cottonwood Creek, finding no sign of rustlers or stolen cattle, only the normal tracks of deer and coyotes coming to water. It was, as he turned to head back, that 6 riders appeared on the ridge above him, blocking his path to the ranch. McKenna recognized them immediately as the kind of men who drifted through cattle country, not cowboys but gunmen, their eyes cold and assessing, their hands never far from their weapons. And riding at their head was Jack Hartwell, his familiar face now stripped of its friendly mask. "Nothing personal, Bull," Hartwell had said as the 6 hired guns surrounded McKenna in the remote canyon, their rifles trained on his chest. "But progress don't wait for old-timers who can't see which way the wind's blowing." McKenna had reached for his revolver, but a rifle butt to his shoulder sent him sprawling from his horse. They'd fallen on him then, beating him with rifle stocks and rope ends, careful to make it look like the work of rustlers or hostile Indians. His ribs cracked under their boots, his face bloomed with blood, and still they continued, methodical in their cruelty. When they'd finished, Hartwell himself had drawn McKenna's own Colt and shot the buckskin gelding that had carried the foreman faithfully for 8 years. The animal's scream of pain had hurt McKenna more than his own injuries. "Should have taken the buyout when you had the chance," Hartwell had called back as they rode away, leaving McKenna broken and alone. "Now you're just another casualty of the changing times." For 4 days, McKenna crawled through the sagebrush and alkali dust, his ribs broken, his left shoulder dislocated, his face so swollen he could barely see. The Wyoming spring was mercurial, blazing sun by day that baked his wounds and chilled his bones by night. He survived on muddy water from buffalo wallows and the bitter roots his Apache friends had taught him to recognize during the Indian Wars. His cowboy skills kept him alive, but barely. He followed creek beds where possible, knowing they would lead to larger water sources. He fashioned a crude splint for his arm from a broken branch and strips torn from his shirt. He kept moving southeast, toward what he hoped was civilization, though each painful yard felt like a mile. By the 4th day, delirium had set in. The sun seemed to speak to him in Marcus Caldwell's voice, urging him to keep going. The stars at night formed patterns that spelled out warnings and promises. He was within hours of death, his lips cracked and bleeding, his tongue swollen from thirst, when he spotted smoke rising from a hidden valley, thin wisps that might have been campfires or cooking hearths. With the last of his strength, he stumbled toward that promise of human presence, not caring anymore whether he found friend or foe. Death was stalking him either way. The settlement he stumbled into was unlike anything he'd expected to find in the Wyoming wilderness. Broken Wheel was no ordinary frontier town with its saloons and general stores. Instead, it was a community of former slaves who'd come west after the Civil War, homesteaders who'd carved out their own piece of the American dream in a valley that most white settlers had dismissed as worthless. The dozen or so buildings were modest but well-maintained, log cabins with stone chimneys, a small church with a hand-carved cross, fields of early wheat and vegetable gardens protected by careful irrigation ditches. It was a place built by people who understood the value of every nail, every board, every seed. The woman who found him collapsed by their well was Sarah Washington, a 42-year-old former house slave who'd become the unofficial leader of the community. She was a small woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by cruelty, but too much goodness to turn away from someone in need. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, recognizing the quality of McKenna's boots and the calluses on his hands that marked him as a working cowman. "What did they do to you, mister?" Her voice was the last thing McKenna heard before darkness claimed him completely. Sarah had been born into slavery on a Virginia plantation, had learned to read in secret by candlelight, studying her master's discarded newspapers and books at great personal risk. She had escaped during the chaos of the war, using her literacy and quick wits to forge passes and travel documents. She'd made her way west with a group of freedmen, using her education and natural leadership to help establish Broken Wheel as a thriving agricultural community. "We grow what we need and sell what we can," she explained, as McKenna recovered in her small but immaculate cabin, the walls adorned with carefully preserved books and hand-stitched quilts that told stories of journey and survival. "Most folks don't even know we're here, and that's how we like it." McKenna learned that the community was entirely self-sufficient, with skilled craftsmen who could build or repair almost anything, experienced farmers who coaxed surprising yields from the challenging soil, and even a former cavalry sergeant named Isaiah Johnson who'd served with the Buffalo Soldiers and now trained the settlement's men in defense tactics. They'd faced down claim jumpers, hostile Indians, and racist settlers, building something lasting through cooperation and mutual support. "Why Broken Wheel?" McKenna asked one evening as he sat on Sarah's porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. Sarah smiled, the expression softening the stern lines of her face. "Our first wagon broke an axle right where the church stands now. Some folks wanted to fix it and move on, but I saw good water, sheltered land, and a place where we might not be bothered. I said, maybe that broken wheel was God's way of telling us we'd gone far enough." She paused, looking out over the communities she'd helped build. Sometimes the best journeys end with a breakdown. As McKenna's strength returned, aided by Sarah's knowledge of herbal medicine and the community's generous sharing of their limited food supplies, he told her about the conspiracy, the betrayal, and his determination to save the ranch that had been his life's work. She listened with the patience of someone who understood that justice was often a luxury that poor folks couldn't afford. "This Hartwell," she said finally, her hands busy mending one of McKenna's shirts, "he thinks being young and ruthless makes him smart?" "He thinks I'm finished," McKenna replied, testing his healing shoulder with careful rotations. A relic from a time when a man's word meant something. "Maybe he's right about the times changing," Sarah said thoughtfully, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Question is, are you going to change with them, or are you going to show them that some things don't need changing?" Their partnership began when Hartwell's men started harassing the Broken Wheel community, trying to drive them off land that the railroad syndicate wanted for their right-of-way. The former slaves had legal homestead claims, but Hartwell and his employers were counting on frontier justice, or the lack thereof, to override such technicalities. McKenna's knowledge of cattle operations and Sarah's understanding of legal procedures made them a formidable team. He taught the community how to protect their livestock from rustlers and how to read the signs of approaching trouble. She showed him how freedmen had learned to use the very laws meant to oppress them as shields against injustice. "You know these ranching laws better than most lawyers," Sarah observed as they planned their strategy over her kitchen table, maps and legal documents spread between them. "And you understand how to organize people better than most generals," McKenna replied, noting how every member of Broken Wheel had specific responsibilities and how information flowed efficiently through the community. "Together, we might just have a chance." They spent weeks gathering evidence of the conspiracy, using Sarah's network of contacts throughout the territory, Former slaves who worked as cooks in prominent households, as laborers on major ranches, as servants in hotels where businessmen discussed their plans openly. And McKenna's relationships with honest cattlemen who resented the railroad's growing influence. The former slaves of Broken Wheel proved to be natural allies in this fight. They understood what it meant to have everything taken from them, to be treated as disposable, and to fight for their rights against overwhelming odds. Their community became a base of operations for McKenna's campaign to reclaim what had been stolen from him and to protect what they had built. Isaiah Johnson, the former Buffalo soldier, took charge of training the men of Broken Wheel in defensive tactics. "We ain't looking for a war," he explained as he showed them how to create defensive positions around the settlement, "but we sure as hell gonna be ready if one comes to us." McKenna sent messages to former Circle M hands who had been dismissed by Hartwell, gathering a small force of loyal cowboys who set up camp in the hills overlooking the ranch. Sarah drafted letters to territorial officials and newspaper editors, documenting the illegal actions of Ashworth and his associates. The final confrontation came sooner than they expected. Word reached Broken Wheel that Hartwell had learned of McKenna's survival and was planning to finish what he'd started. The young foreman arrived at the settlement with a dozen hired guns, claiming to be investigating reports of cattle rustling, but clearly intent on eliminating both McKenna and any witnesses to their crimes. But McKenna was ready for them, and he wasn't alone. The people of Broken Wheel had transformed their peaceful community into a fortress, with firing positions concealed in buildings and behind stone walls, escape routes planned for the children and elderly, and carefully staged supplies in case of a siege. "Well, I'll be damned." Hartwell laughed when he saw McKenna step out of Sarah's cabin, a Winchester rifle in his hands and his face set in grim determination. "The old bull's still breathing." "Still breathing, still fighting," McKenna replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legendary among working cowboys. "And still protecting what's mine." "Nothing here is yours, old man," Hartwell sneered, his hand hovering near his pistol. "This land belongs to the railroad now. These people are squatters, and you're a ghost who doesn't know he's dead yet." "That's where you're wrong, Jack," McKenna said, nodding slightly to signal his allies. "A man owns what he's willing to die for. These people understand that better than you ever will." The battle was fierce, but decisive. Hartwell's men, expecting an easy victory against a handful of former slaves and one broken-down cowboy, found themselves caught in a carefully planned crossfire. McKenna's marksmanship was matched by the military precision of Isaiah Johnson and his Buffalo Soldier veterans, while Sarah's people fought with the desperation of those defending their homes and hard-won freedom. When the smoke cleared, Hartwell and most of his men were dead or wounded, while the survivors faced the rifles of McKenna's allies and the righteous anger of people who had been pushed too far. The evidence Sarah had gathered was enough to bring federal marshals into the territory, leading to investigations that exposed the railroad syndicate's illegal land grab and the corruption that had facilitated it. The scandal led to reforms that protected small ranchers and homesteaders throughout the territory. Ashworth was forced to honor his uncle's verbal agreement, signing over a quarter interest in the Circle M to McKenna. The railroad was required to negotiate fair compensation for land access rather than simply seizing what they wanted. McKenna was offered his old job back as foreman of the Circle M, but he declined, choosing instead to help Sarah expand Broken Wheel into a model community that combined cattle ranching with sustainable farming. His knowledge of the land complemented her organizational skills, creating an operation that thrived while neighboring spreads struggled. "You could have your ranch back," Sarah said one evening as they stood on the ridge overlooking their valley, watching the sunset paint the grasslands gold and the shadows lengthen across land that now legally belonged to people who had once been property themselves. "I've got something better," McKenna replied, taking her work-hardened hand in his scarred one. "I've got a place where what a man builds matters more than what he owns." In the years that followed, Broken Wheel became legendary throughout Wyoming. a community where former slaves and displaced cowboys worked together, where honest dealing was the only currency that mattered, and where two people who'd been discarded by society proved that the strongest foundations are built on mutual respect and shared struggle. The grasslands that had nearly claimed Daniel McKenna's life instead gave him purpose, partnership, and the chance to use his skills for something greater than mere profit. And Sarah Washington found that the freedom she'd fought so hard to win was even sweeter when shared with someone who understood that true strength came not from dominance, but from the courage to stand up for what was right. Years later, when travelers spoke of the ghost of Broken Wheel Ranch, they weren't referring to a haunting presence, but to the legend of a man who had returned from the dead to create something that would outlast both him and the forces that had tried to destroy him. A legacy written not in dust, but in the enduring bonds between people who had found in each other the family they had never known they needed.